Hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming out tonight for Authors on Stage. I'm Erin. I am the programming librarian here at New Canaan Library, and I am so glad you're here. Before we begin, I want to point out a couple of exciting things that we have scheduled for next week. First, for all of you Downton Abbey fans, anybody in there? Anybody a Downton Abbey fan? I see some hands. You do not have to wait till 2016 and season 6 to get your fix. We are going to do next Tuesday, the 9th at 6:30. We have a really exciting talk from Susan Jerome, who is the Historic Textile and Costume Collection at URI, and she is going to look at all of the glamorous fashions from all of the 5 seasons so far. So if you have ever looked at some of those beautiful frocks and thought, I would really like to wear that, she's going to talk about the fashion behind that and how that sort of influenced social change and was a barometer for how women's roles were changing at the time. And it's fascinating. She has been known to go on for like hours with questions because people are so fascinated by her talk, and she's coming from a really historic collection at URI. So that's going to be a great thing that's going to happen next week. That's Tuesday, 6:30, right here in the Lamb Room. So please come join us. The second program that I want to share is the kickoff to our Summer Sounds concert series, which is going to start next Saturday, the 13th, on the Library Green. We're doing outdoor concerts. There's 3 of them. We're going to kick things off with the award-winning Atwater Donnelly Band for American folk and Celtic music. Next Saturday, 1 p.m., Library Green. So come enjoy the farmers market in the morning, join us for some music in the afternoon, and visit the book sale, because we are also having a book sale next weekend. So we've got flyers in the back with all of our upcoming programs on that, so feel free to grab those and join us throughout the month. And now for our featured event. It is always such a pleasure to welcome authors to our library. And tonight I'm very pleased to introduce Emily St. John Mandel. Her most recent novel, Station 11, was a finalist this year for the National Book Award, and the PEN/Faulkner Award was the New York Times bestseller list. Emily was born and raised in British Columbia. She studied contemporary dance at the School of Toronto Dance Theatre, Montreal, before relocating to New York, where she is currently a staff writer for The Millions. And we are so glad to have her here for her 67th stop on her author's tour. So she is a trooper, and she's coming to talk tonight about Station 11. So please join me in welcoming her to Authors on Stage.
Good evening. Thank you so much for being here today. I usually don't get to make quite that dramatic an entrance. That was fun. So thank you all so much for coming. I thought what I'd do is talk for about 20 or 30 minutes about Station 11, about some of the research and thinking that went into the book. And if we have time, maybe I'll read for about 2 minutes or so. And if any of you have any questions, if there's anything I didn't cover in the course of the talk that you'd like me to talk about, we'll do a little Q&A at the end. So I think several of you here this evening have already read the book, but thank you. For anybody who hasn't, if you were maybe dragged here by somebody who did read it, Station 11 is about a traveling Shakespearean theater company in a post-apocalyptic North America. And that's what I always give as a sort of elevator pitch. But, it is also about more about the survival of art and themes around what it means to be human, what it means to have civilization when everything falls away. The starting point for this book was partly just that I wanted to write something very different from my previous 3 novels. And those first 3 books, I was happy with the way they turned out, but they were often categorized as literary noir, or sometimes as crime fiction, depending on the market. And I really never set out to write in any particular genre, but I have always set out to write literary fiction with the strongest possible plot. And an unexpected side effect of that has been that if you do focus on plot, that can sometimes sort of drive you to the edge of what we call genre. You know, it turns out, for example, that if you write literary fiction with a crime in it, you've written a crime novel. I was surprised. So, you know, things like that. So I realized after my third novel that if I kept on going in this vein indefinitely, I would eventually be pigeonholed as a crime writer. And I do very much like crime fiction, but the thought of being pigeonholed as anything was so intensely unappealing to me. So I thought, okay, it's a good moment to try something completely different. So for my fourth novel, I thought it would be this very quiet, not very plot-driven literary novel about the life of an actor. And my husband's a writer as well, mostly short stories, but he used to write plays. And so that gave me a kind of glancing, secondhand familiarity with the way, way, way off Broadway theater world in New York. And it's an interesting world. The artists in that world, it's really about the work. They're not making any money off it. They'll have 1 or 2 or 3 day jobs. They're all waiters and work in catering companies. And that was an interesting world to me. So I thought my fourth novel would be just about the life of an actor in present-day Canada, moving from town to town, one of these sort of scrappy, underfunded little theater companies performing Shakespeare. And that would have been such a boring book. I'm so happy I didn't write that. As I started thinking about what the book would be, I thought, well, I do want to write about the lives of actors and about this traveling theater company. But there was something else that I'd been wanting to write about for a while. And I wasn't really sure how to address it. But what I wanted to consider and to write about was the awe I feel at this world in which we find ourselves. And you read the paper, you hear the news, and obviously a lot of things about this world are completely appalling. But somebody walked into this room this morning, flipped a switch, and the room was flooded with electric light. You can cross the Atlantic Ocean in 5 hours. I called my husband earlier, by which I mean I entered a series of numbers into a handheld device, and that resulted in a signal being beamed to the satellites and back down to Earth. These are extraordinary things. And of course, we don't really notice them because you never notice the things that you have the luxury of taking for granted. But it seemed to me that a way to notice these things and a way to write about them would be to write about their absence. So I decided to keep that idea of the traveling theater company, but set it in a post-apocalyptic landscape. Susan Sontag said something interesting in an interview once. She said, "What I love, what draws me very much to writing, is it's a way of paying attention to the world." I love that quote. It resonates with me because it has always been my instinct. I've always tried to make an effort to pay attention to the world, as much attention as possible. And as I was writing Station 11, I found myself thinking about all these details that surround us, the running water, the electricity, the extraordinary ease of travel. Thinking about how fascinating and terrifying it would be to lose those things, and trying to imagine the world that we'd live in their absence. The question that I've tried to address in Station 11 is, what would we miss? What would we hold on to and try to recreate if all the trappings of civilization were to fall away? I remember describing the premise of my new novel to my husband a few years ago. I was laying it out to him. I had this crazy idea about a traveling Shakespearean theater company in a post-apocalyptic North America. And he said something interesting that stayed with me. He said, people would want what was best about the world. And that served as a sort of guiding light to me as I was thinking about what the book would be. And this is obviously a completely subjective value judgment on my part, but it seems to me that one of the things that was best about the world would include the work of William Shakespeare. So I set out to try to learn more about his life and about his works. And early on, as I was writing this book, I had the company performing plays from a whole range of eras. So it was William Shakespeare. It was also David Mamet. It was also modern teleplays, episodes of Seinfeld and How I Met Your Mother, which might have been interesting, but it started to seem a little bit incongruous to me that these post-apocalyptic theater audiences would necessarily be really gripped by comedies about the New York City dating world or, real estate, for example. So I thought perhaps a good demarcation point would be to make the symphony's repertoire consist of plays from before the age of widespread electricity. That seemed to me to be a very clear line. So I narrowed the repertoire to that point, and then I realized I really didn't know anything about Shakespeare's life. So I set out to learn more and started rereading some of the plays. And I began to find the most interesting echoes between Elizabethan England and this post-pandemic world that I was writing about. I guess the most obvious one is that in Shakespeare's time, theater was so often a matter of these small traveling companies setting out on the road. They would perform these works from town to town. And what we often forget about the plays of Shakespeare's time, and even Shakespeare's plays, is that this was popular entertainment. There was nothing elitist about it. So they'd travel from town to town, and I found that I really liked the symmetry of that parallel, the idea of a world in which such a company might again set out on the road, with the age of electricity having come and gone. But there was something else I hadn't previously considered, which was the impact of the bubonic plague on Shakespeare's life and time. Shakespeare was born in a plague year. He was born in 1564. In the first half of that year, the town registry for Stratford-upon-Avon showed 20 deaths. The second half of 1564, there were more than 200. That was the year when 24% of London's population died in that plague outbreak. So, here's Shakespeare, the third born to his parents, but the first to survive infancy, somehow survives that terrible year. It's hard to imagine a more terrifying time and place to bring a child into the world, but Shakespeare somehow makes it. And the plague does continue to resonate and echo throughout his life. 3 of his siblings died young. His brother Edmund was a probable plague victim. He died at 27 during an outbreak in London. Shakespeare had a son, Hamnet, who died at 11 and left behind a twin. And historians can't say with certainty what exactly killed Hamnet Shakespeare. They do speculate that it might have been plague. It affects the course of his career, the works that he writes. Perhaps Shakespeare, who specialized in rewrites, in writing collaboratively with other playwrights, perhaps he would have, under any circumstances, eventually emerged as a wholly original writer. But London's theaters closed for about a year and a half early on in his careers because the plague was widespread. What happened during those periods in London was the actors would leave. They would leave the city and go on tour. Shakespeare emerges from that enforced sabbatical of a year and a half and begins writing sonnets. He begins writing some of the plays that become known as his masterpieces, A Midsummer Night's Dream, Romeo and Juliet. It changes the course of his work. And it's interesting, you see it here and there in the plays themselves. And sometimes it's quite overt. There's a moment in King Lear when Lear compares one of his daughters to a plague sore. Sometimes, which is brutal, but sometimes much less so. There's a moment in Hamlet that I find myself thinking about, when Hamlet encounters the ghost of his father for the first time. Hamlet's father stands on the parapet, describing his untimely death to his son. And the words he uses, I'm paraphrasing slightly, but it's to the effect that there was a poison that ran swift as quicksilver through his body. In the context of that time and place, with plague flickering over the landscape, theaters closing, it's so easy to imagine a quicksilver contagion doing the same. And perhaps I'm reaching there. Maybe what's on the page is all there is, and there's no connection whatsoever to Shakespeare's son. But as William Shakespeare writes those words, his son, Hamnet, has been dead for no more than 3 years. So it's interesting to think about that Hamlet stands on one side of death, his father on the other, a toxicant between them. And Shakespeare's son, Hamnet, has just recently passed away. So these were the things that I found myself thinking about and writing about. And some of the other research into the book was equally interesting to me. Some of it was frankly quite strange, because I feel like With any novel, the reader has to overcome a barrier of imagination. That as readers, these characters have to be real to us, at least real enough that we care what happens to them, even though we know they're fictional. With a novel set in the future, it seems to me that the imaginative barrier is even higher, because not only do we have to make the leap of believing in these characters, we have to make the leap of believing in the world that's being presented on the page that isn't quite like the place where we live. So, it's such a fine line, because as a writer, you don't want to weigh the reader down with a mass of extraneous detail, like how to make soap in the absence of the electrical grid, these things that you don't want to think about. On the other hand, you don't want to create any stumbling blocks, moments where the reader is jolted out of the story because you made a silly mistake, like put a gasoline-powered vehicle 10 years after the pandemic when gasoline goes stale in year 3. Those moments like that. So I found myself falling down the strangest Google rabbit holes as I was working on this book. So for example, the Symphony's caravans are extended bed Ford pickup trucks pulled by horses. So figuring that out, what is the weight of an extended bed Ford pickup truck with the engine removed? How big do the wheels need to be for that vehicle to be safely pulled by horses? Should they be oxen? But then they can't be oxen because this is a post-apocalyptic symphony. So if you're a post-apocalyptic violinist and you break a string, you're not going to go into the bow shop and get that fixed. You really need a horse's tail to restring that yourself. So figuring out all of those things, it'd be 3 a.m, I'd be on Google trying to get this right. It was the strangest sequence of searches. And then I realized I didn't really have a firm grasp of what it meant to live off the grid for any extended period of time. Like a lot of us, I'd gone through periods where the power was out for a few days or a week at the most. But that's different from the power being out forever. So I thought, who lives off the grid? Where can I get a better sense of what that life might look like? So I spent some time on survivalist message boards, which, incidentally, I absolutely do not recommend. that is the creepiest corner of the entire internet. It was really useful in terms of getting a sense of things like making your own soap, these realities you'd have to deal with. But a typical post would be along the lines of me and the wife are taking our 4 kids and our arsenal of semi-automatic weaponry and moving off the grid to our 40 acres in rural Tennessee. Does anybody have any suggestions for homeschooling materials? And you just think, this will end well. It's like, what could possibly go wrong? So, that was creepy. But I think the most interesting research I ended up doing, aside from the work that I did and reading about Shakespeare's life, was reading about the history of pandemics. I wanted to get a better sense of the mechanisms of mass contagion and what pandemics had looked like over the course of our history. Because in Station 11, it is a flu that ends the world. So I started reading about it, and the thing with this topic is that epidemiologists are very much like seismologists, in the sense that nobody talks in terms of if there will ever again be another earthquake. This is just something that happens to us and that has happened over and over. And I found myself coming across some interesting stories. In the middle of the 2nd century, Roman soldiers returning from their siege of the Mesopotamian capital of Seleucia brought a strange new illness back to the capital. And victims of the Antonine Plague, as it came to be called, would develop a whole array of horrible symptoms, vomiting, high fevers, etc. After a few days of this, a terrible rash would bloom over their skin. And historians don't know exactly what this was. There's no way to be absolutely certain of what afflicted these people. But they generally agree that the Antonine Plague was smallpox. That was smallpox's introduction to Europe. The population had no immunity. In parts of the Roman Empire, 1 in 3 people died. What's interesting is that the Romans thought, or they feared, that they'd brought this calamity upon themselves by their actions in Seleucia. In Seleucia's Temple of Apollo, after they had ransacked and burnt the city, they went into the Temple of Apollo, They were ransacking that as well. And they came across, this is the contemporary historian Ammianus Marcellinus, they came across a narrow hole in the temple floor. When the Romans opened the hole in the hope that it might contain valuables, Marcellinus wrote that there issued a pestilence loaded with the force of incurable disease, which polluted the whole world from the borders of Persia to the Rhine and Gaul with contagion and death. And that explanation might seem a little silly to us now, but they were grasping wildly for an explanation for the nightmare that had befallen them. And I think that in its outlandishness, the explanation touches upon the root of our fear around illness, which is that illness still carries a terrible mystery. And even now, we know more than we ever have before about the way illness works, about the mechanisms of viruses and bacteria and cells. But there is still this awful mystery to it. We don't always know why one person will develop cancer and another won't. Sometimes we don't know why one cancer will disappear forever, while another will lie dormant following treatment and then come back years later. In flu season, we don't always know why one person gets sick and another person's completely fine. There's an awful randomness about it. And an unsettling thing about writing a book where an illness takes out a civilization is that you quickly begin to realize that what you've written is an exaggeration of a non-fictional premise. It's something that's happened repeatedly throughout history. 17 centuries after the Antonine Plague, Captain George Vancouver sets out from England on the HMS Discovery. His mission is to find the Northwest Passage, which is fabled and doesn't actually turn out to exist, but it was supposed to be a passage that would connect the Pacific and the Atlantic Oceans, which would be incredible for Asia to Europe trade. He sets out from Britain. In the spring of 1792, he reaches the west coast of what later becomes British Columbia, Canada. He and his crew travel northward through this incredibly lush and verdant landscape. It's a beautiful temperate climate. It's incredibly green, but it seems strangely empty. What he writes in his journal is that they travel 150 miles of those shores without seeing that number of inhabitants. When his crew does venture ashore, they find villages that could house hundreds of people, but they're standing abandoned. Everyone's left. As they explore further, they begin to find graves among the trees. When they do encounter survivors, those survivors have terrible scars. Some of them are missing an eye, and terrible stories, because smallpox has already arrived. But what's interesting is that as terrible as that history is, and that's just one instance out of countless ones, it can leave you with a fatalistic kind of hope if you research it, because as a species, we have always managed to survive. Dealing with pandemics is part of being human. I thought I'd talk in these last few minutes just for a second about post-apocalyptic novels as a genre. There have been so many of them recently. We've seen enormous numbers of them, and in touring for Station 11, I've heard a lot of theories about why this is. And the one that comes up the most frequently is that our interest in post-apocalyptic fiction is a natural reflection of the anxiety that we feel at this fraught world in which we live. That the world is in many ways deeply compromised. Climate change is upon us. These are terrifying times. But what's interesting about that is that you look at history and you talk to people, and what you begin to think is, when has it ever seemed as though the world wasn't ending? And you think about the obvious moments, the First and the Second World War, the Spanish flu, or say 1968 in this country, the riots, the political assassinations. How dangerous and fraught and close to the edge it must have seemed. But what's even more interesting to me is we seem to think the world's ending even in times that seem as though they would have been quite tranquil, at least in retrospect. I had an interesting conversation with my mother recently, where she talked about how she and her friends felt somewhat guilty about bringing children into this dangerous world. This was in the late 70s and early 80s in Western Canada. I mean, it's really hard to imagine a more tranquil time or place. But that was the height of the Cold War. They were worried about nuclear annihilation. So my point is just that it somehow always seems like the end of the world to us. I don't know if it's narcissism or pessimism or some combination thereof, but it's as though we always want to believe that we're living at the climax of the story, that we're living at the end of history, that now, after thousands of years and generations of false alarms, now is finally the worst that it's ever been, and we're right on the edge. But that raises an interesting question, which is that what if it always is the end of the world? My mother visited me in New York a while back, and we went to a wonderful exhibit at the Morgan Library of old illuminated manuscripts. And there was one in particular that stood out. It was a tiny little square book with an embroidered cover. It had been made in 1544 by an 11-year-old Elizabeth II as a New Year's gift for her stepmother, Catherine Parr. It was an English translation of a French poem. She had the most beautiful calligraphy. What my mother pointed out is that that wasn't really that long ago that that book was made in the grand scheme of human history. That was about 470 years old. It's about 6 lifetimes laid end to end. But the world in which that book was written has long since ended. And you can't point to any grand cataclysm that ended it. But it's gone. It's completely gone. So it follows to me that the world's always ending, and that a new world is always coming into creation around us so slowly and so subtly that you only notice it in retrospect. I'm going to close with a very brief reading from Station 11. This is a chapter in which the symphony is performing A Midsummer Night's Dream. And I think that's probably all you need to know going in. They are performing, so here's some dialogue from Shakespeare. What was lost in the collapse? Almost everything, almost everyone, but there is still such beauty. Twilight in the altered world, a performance of A Midsummer Night's Dream in a parking lot in the mysteriously named town of St. Deborah by the water, Lake Michigan shining a half-mile away. Kirsten is Titania, a crown of flowers on her close-cropped hair, the jagged scar on her cheekbone half erased by candlelight. The audience is silent. Saeed, circling her in a tuxedo that Kirsten found in a dead man's closet near the town of East Jordan. Tarry, rash wanton, am I not thy lord? Then I must be thy lady. Lines of a play written in 1594, the year London's theaters reopened after 2 seasons of plague. Or written possibly a year later, in 1595, a year before the death of Shakespeare's only son. Some centuries later, on a distant continent, Kirsten moves across the stage in a cloud of painted fabric, half in rage, half in love. She wears a wedding dress that she scavenged from a house near New Petoskey, the chiffon and silk streaked with shades of blue from a child's watercolor kit. But with thy brawls, she continues, thou hast disturbed our sport. She never feels more alive than at these moments. When on stage, she fears nothing. Therefore the winds, piping to us in vain, as in revenge, have sucked up from the sea contagious fogs. Pestilential, a note in the text explains, next to the word contagious, in Kirsten's favorite of the 3 versions of the text that the symphony carries. Shakespeare was the 3rd born to his parents, but the first to survive infancy. 3 of his siblings died young. His son, Hamnet, died at 11 and left behind a twin. Plague closed the theaters again and again, death flickering over the landscape. And now in a twilight once more lit by candles, the age of electricity having come and gone, Titania turns to face her fairy king. Therefore the moon, the governess of floods, pale in her anger, washes all the air, that rheumatic diseases do abound. Oberon watches her with his entourage of fairies. Titania speaks as if to herself now, Oberon forgotten. Her voice carries high and clear over the silent audience, over the string section waiting for their cue on stage left. And through this distemperature, we hear the seasons alter. All 3 caravans of the Traveling Symphony are labeled as such, the Traveling Symphony lettered in white on both sides. But the lead caravan carries an additional line of text, because survival is insufficient. Thank you. So I'm happy to answer any questions.